Hi, agents. Let's go over the addendum for sale of other property by buyer. On the first line here is the address of the property the buyer is going to purchase. And in paragraph A says that this contract is subject to the buyer collecting the proceeds from the sale of his home. If his house doesn't sell by the date written here, this contract will terminate automatically and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. It also says that if the buyer does not waive his contingency by this date, that the contract will terminate and earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. If the buyer is in receipt of the proceeds from the sale of his home by this date, the contract moves forward. Usually the closing date of the buyer's current home contract goes here, but never past that date. And note that if the closing date in the buyer's current home contract is extended, it may be necessary to extend this date as well. On this first line here, that's where you're going to put the address of the property the buyer needs to sell. All right, so in paragraph B says that if the seller accepts a backup offer and the offer is executed, the seller can ask the buyer to waive his contingency, aka make this contract no longer subject to selling his home first. If asked to waive it, the buyer has however many days written here to waive it. If the buyer does not waive it, the contract will terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. Usually the number of days written here is between 1 to 3 days. That's what I usually see. Note that a buyer is only obligated to waive his contingency only if asked by the seller after he executes a backup offer. And we'll go over the proper form for this here in a second. Also note that a buyer shouldn't waive his contingency unless he has the funds in hand, or at the very least a clear to close on his property. If you're representing the buyer, you should also encourage him to speak to their lender before waiving it as well. In paragraph C, it says that if a buyer agrees to waive their contingency, they must notify the seller and must deposit additional earnest money within 3 days. That notice we'll go over here in a second. The amount written here is negotiable, but I usually see between $500 on up, maybe $500 to $1,000. But note that the seller will want a good amount here, just in case the buyer takes a gamble and waives their contingency without having the funds proceeds in hand. Paragraph D says if the buyer waives the contingency and it turns out he can't close because he failed to sell his home, so he was unable to collect the proceeds from the sale of his home, that the buyer will be in default. And the seller can then exercise the remedies specified in the default paragraph in the contract. And then paragraph E says that the dates and the timelines in this addendum must be strictly followed. So to give you, let's go over the notice that's mentioned here. When a seller asks a buyer to waive their contingency, they're going to give this notice to the buyer. And this is called the notices regarding contingency under addendum for sale of other property by buyer. This is what the seller gives the buyer. And in A, it says, number 1, seller has accepted another written offer to purchase the property, also known as a backup offer. It's executed, earnest money and option fee, if applicable, has been deposited. Number 2, buyer may waive the contingency by notifying seller in writing of the waiver and depositing any required additional earnest money with the escrow agent within the time required under the for sale of the property by buyer addendum. What that means in writing, it's just right here, paragraph B. They'll respond, so that's their way of notifying the seller. And then 3, if buyer does not waive the contingency and deposit the additional earnest money within the time required, the contract will terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to buyer. So the seller signs this, sends it to the buyer, and the buyer responds with either 1, they'll waive the contingency and deposit the additional earnest money with the escrow agent, or they won't waive the contingency and the contract will terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. Real briefly, I'll go over the backup contract just to point out in paragraph A, it does say the contract to which this addendum is attached is binding upon execution of the parties, and the earnest money and option fee are paid as provided in the backup contract. So that's just another way to reiterate that this before a seller can ask a buyer to waive their contingency, this addendum, this backup addendum, must be executed with the contract as well as the earnest money and option fee deposited. So an example of waiving the contingency. Let me give you an example. The seller accepts an offer with a contingency and later receives another more favorable offer. That backup contract is signed along with the backup addendum. The seller should use the TXR 1912, which is this form here we just went over, to notify the buyer and ask the buyer to waive their contingency. The buyer now has the option to waive her contingency and deposit the additional earnest money, or terminate and get the earnest money back. A frequently asked question is, will a third party protect the buyer if their home doesn't sell? It only protects the buyer only if the buyer can prove that she didn't get approved for the loan for any other reason aside from failing to sell her home and collect the proceeds. If the reason she didn't get approved for the loan is because she didn't sell her home and because she didn't get the proceeds from the home, that's the third party does not protect her. And the buyer should consult with his lender before waiving once again. So I think that's it. If you have any other questions, call the office. You can call me or call Bill. We're happy to help. I hope that clears up any confusion. Thank you.